Hey everyone, welcome back to Naturally Inspired Media. I am Tasha Jackson, and I am here today to talk to you about all of the ways that I have been devalued in my life. So let me kind of go back and explain the inspiration for doing this. So as many of you know, I'm really in touch with the people that are in my community. I go out to the grocery store and I talk to the people there. I go out to the smaller stores, smaller local businesses that I support, and I talk to people there, developing relationships and things like that. And so I actually want to kind of dedicate this series to Randall. So, Randall, I hope that you get out of this series as much as I hope that you can, and then also help to educate and inspire others through the exchange that we have had, the conversations that we have had together. So, Randall works at the guitar store in my community, a small local business in my community, and he just fixes guitars. He's like been a professional musician and things like that. And he's kind of retired from doing that, which I'm trying to talk him into coming out of, but I don't know if that's going to work. Um, and so my son plays guitar, and I needed hit a strap added, and then my kids over the years, like my daughter plays flute and was playing violin and things like that. So like over the years, I've gotten to know Randall. And so one day we were talking about how we grew up and the different ways that our lives kind of unfolded. And so one of the reasons why I started doing this in the first place is because I'm a really private person. I don't really talk about my childhood. I don't talk about my personal life. There are a lot of things that I don't talk about, but then other people talk about themselves to me, and I have really started to realize, from not just from doing this video series, but beforehand, that a lot of people go through a lot of the same things in life. And so, um, I'm hoping that by disclosing some of the more traumatic things that have happened to me, or by discussing some of the ways that I have been able to overcome some of the societal pressures, or some of the family pressures, or some of the peer pressures that we experience in life, that people will be able to overcome whatever challenges they have in their own life, and trauma as well. I am working on a book called Healing from Traumatic Relationships, and an additional course to go along with that. But I don't know when that's going to come out, because I have a lot of things going on in my personal life right now. And so that project is a little bit more slow going. However, as soon as I have the book written and published and the course launched, I will make sure to communicate that to everyone. So the way that I want to kind of construct this series is I'm going to shoot the video all in one go, because a lot of these topics are related. But if I talk about all of these things all at once, the video will become very, very, very long. So I'm going to just kind of segment them and then schedule them so that it's a little bit shorter. Okay. So Randall, here we go. Many of my stories always start off with me discussing what happened to me in childhood. But this time I need to discuss what happened to my mother in her childhood. Because and I will talk about generational trauma a little bit later. And then I will also talk about, some of the ways that my mom and I have been able to make our relation, or to heal our relationship. Well, first of all, work while we were not really in communication, but also how we started to kind of heal our relationship over time. It's been a very slow going process, and both of us have had to be very patient while we work on ourselves before we could come together and work together on the relationship. Um, and so I want to just kind of take a step back and acknowledge that my childhood trauma did not start with my mother. My childhood trauma started with my grandparents. And I'm sure that because it's generational, their grandparents and their grandparents, but I don't have access to that information. So, little known fact about me, my grandfather was a Klansman. So, my mother is white and was partially raised in Alabama. And my great grandmother on my father's side is from Mississippi. And so, you can imagine my mom growing up in a Klan family would have been traumatic. And in that, my mom, from a very young age, disagreed with those ideas, right? So my mom was always questioning, like, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we burn a cross in the front yard? Why do we go to these meetings? Like those kinds of things. And so that that plays into my whole entire life essentially. And so my mom, through her own trauma, like my grandfather was abusive, my grandmother took my mom and my one uncle, and then she was pregnant with my other uncle, back to St. Louis where she is from. So I was born in St. Louis. And my mother was a teenage mother because, as you can imagine, growing up in a family where you don't really accept those values and then moving, and then having a very traumatic exit from that, and then moving to, another city, trying to readjust. My grandmother at that point would have been a single mom, which back in those times, it was very frowned upon for a woman to be divorced and not have a man around. So you can imagine my grandmother very quickly tried to find a new husband. And unfortunately, that husband was also very racist and very abusive. And so my mom, acted out. She ended up getting pregnant at 15 and then had me at 16. And so what essentially then happened, like in the 80s, it was like that teenage pregnancy, you know, epidemic that had happened in the United States, things like that. And so all of these recorded statistics were saying, the children of pregnant teens, right? And we're not, and this kind of also plays into the gender or the sex thing as well, because, like, where is the man or where is the boy, right? In this response, in this situation of responsibility, there's no accountability for the male whatsoever. So my biological father, of course, him being like, I'm a teenager, I'm not ready to be a dad, like, skip down, right? So here's my mom trying to raise me by herself at 16 years old. She got kicked out of her house. And then especially whenever they found out that I was brown, that did not obviously go over very well. And so my mom did the best that she could with what she was given in the circumstances she had, right? And so one of the things from healing our relationship that I have really come to have to understand is her perspective and what she was going through during that time and how that impacted her. Okay. So my mom, so the statistics were coming out that were saying, basically, you're going to continue to live in poverty. You're never going to go to college. You're never going to amount to anything. And so my mom, being a very different type of person, the way, even though we had trauma and we did live in poverty, it was really hard. My mom always advocated for me. My mom always looked out for me. My mom always supported me. There were instances where she had peer pressure where that was not the case, which is where a lot of our strife and our issues really came from was whenever she was looking for outside help or were being influenced from the outside. And so that added to my troubles, right? As a child and then as an early adolescent. And so I grew up with constantly hearing that because I was born to a teenage mother, that essentially I'll just water it down for you. I wouldn't amount to anything. So that's the first thing. Okay, I have here, I'll show you. Here's the list. Here are the list of ways that I've been devalued, either from my family, from my peers, or from society itself, that I'm going to cover in this very segmented long video series. And so that's essentially what I heard. And so um however, me being an Aquarius, I was like, no, that sounds like a challenge to me. So anytime that anyone, comes up to me and is like, you're not going to do XYZ, and I'm like, oh, watch me, right? That's my personality, right? And so I was very much going to challenge that. Just because I was born to a teenage mother, it doesn't mean that my mother was not intelligent. My mother is very highly intelligent. My mom knows how to strategize. My mom knows how to survive. My mom knows how to do a lot of things that, unfortunately, a lot of other women in her situation would have not been able to pull through. And a lot of women, especially in the 80s, or a lot of girls, gave their babies up for adoption. My mom did not. My mom did not have an abortion, and my mom did not give me up for adoption. My mom soldiered and carried through as best as she could, right? But again, it was difficult. So you have a 16-year-old working at McDonald's, and then we were living off of government assistance. So back then, and many kids from the 80s that were also on government assistance will remember this. Food stamps used to come as like coupons, color-coded coupons that you could actually give to the cashier that were money, and then you would receive money back. So you would give the coupon and then you would receive money back. And then back in those days, you could buy alcohol and cigarettes with them too. And then there was also government food, which was just processed, pre-packaged food. Like the cheese was like Velveeta cheese log. It would come in white packaging with just black letters that would just be like cheese and have a picture of a slice of cheese. Or like the fruits and vegetables, it would just say corn and have a picture of corn on it. And so from living in poverty, I became very malnourished as a child. So by the time I was in second grade, I was incredibly overweight. I was starting to develop some health issues. But again, at that time, it was very poorly understood, the correlation between how what we eat affects our body, like that saying, like, you are what you eat. Um, it's so very true, and I will have a video about all of that later. This again, this whole entire series is just my entire life's experience and all the lessons that I have learned from life. And so, on one hand, you're being like essentially forced to eat a lot of, packaged food that is provided by the government because it's what you have. But on the flip side of that, and this is another thing my mom and I were just talking about a week and a half ago, is that I partially grew up in the country in St. Louis, so in Missouri. So I grew up mostly in St. Louis, but then I also would travel to a small town, southern Missouri, where I was raised by a stepdad's family. And so we would go, like, all the men would go hunting, they would go fishing. My great grandmother had a victory garden. Whenever my mom bought a house, we ended up having a garden. So we were eating a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables and a lot of game and fish that we would catch ourselves, and we lived off of the land more so than We were eating, processed food. That was in the 80s. Now, come the 90s. In the 90s, corporate America just exploded. Everyone was getting super busy. Prepackaged food was a huge thing. It's Cookie Crisp and Fruity Pebbles, and milk was really starting to be a thing. Orange juice, that industry was starting to really be a thing. So, and then of course you had Coke and Pepsi and all of this packaged, like high carb, high fat, high sugar foods started to come out that then became a huge staple of kids that were born in the 80s, right? And then of course you have like the school lunch program, which again, high carb, high sugar, high fat processed food is getting into schools. And so from there, I started to become very malnourished and I started to gain a lot of weight, but also I had childhood trauma that I was gaining weight from as well. There's a really excellent book called When the Body Says No. And then there's another book, I forgot the name of it, but it's basically how trauma gets trapped in the body. And then you also might want to do some research on the vagus nerve and the polyvagal theory, for how childhood trauma especially is trapped inside of our bodies and trapped in our nervous system and is recorded there. And so I started to become malnourished, but we didn't know at that time because, again, the correlation in between all of this junk food that was flooding the markets, like I'm sure everyone was eating pizza rolls and bagel bites, right? Like that's a big deal, or that was a big deal back then. Toaster strudels, things like that. And so, again, we switched from eating off of the land for the most part to eating a lot of processed food. And so that was where the train of malnourishment then came from. So then as I'm going through my childhood, I have, and I'm sure many of you also have had this experience of, what do you know, you're just a kid, right? Children, and again, I've been teaching for 15 years. Children have a really great intelligence and they have perspectives that need to be valued and heard, because there have been many times whenever I faced a problem that I didn't know how to solve. And then here comes my daughter and she's like, Mommy, why don't you just do this? And it was like, boom, solution. And I was like, wow, thank you so much. If I had not thought of that, I would never have figured that out. Or they see things that I can't see because my mind is still, very busy with all of these other things. And so just merely being a child, I was incredibly devalued for my opinion, for my perspective, for my look on life. And, that was something that, at times still kind of follows with me for older generations. I'm 39 and then they'll say, oh, you're just a baby. What do you know? Like, well, a lot actually. And so if you have had that said to you, then that is a way that you have been devalued, right? Another thing is that I'm really nerdy. I'm incredibly nerdy. Like as a kid, I was reading a lot of books. Like you have heard my stories of how I started studying astrology and how I started studying physics and astronomy from a very young age. And you know, I always had that curiosity. I wanted to understand, how do things work? Why are things the way that they are? Again, I'm an Aquarius and I'm driven by understanding how systems work. Okay. So how do all of the systems that we have work? And so anytime that I would learn something new, I would go and share that. But unfortunately, because I was a girl, and this is another part of it too, because I was an intelligent female, that was something that had to be devalued immediately, because women, children were seen and not heard, and women especially were not entitled to an opinion. They were not entitled to advice. Um, they, the man of the house was the one who made the decisions. All of these different things were happening in the 80s that were still very reminiscent of kind of the past. A lot of those things are really falling away at this point, but I want to bring this up because I know that there are a lot of people that were born in the 80s and maybe the early 90s that are, and then also maybe the late 70s that still have some of these ways that they have been devalued that are incredibly impactful in a negative way on themselves and what's happening in their life. And so again, I want to inspire and educate people to, in a sense, be that voice that says, you're not the only one out there. It was a widespread societal thing, especially to be brown and a female and to be intelligent. That was something that was incredibly, like, just unheard of, right, during that time. And so, you know, I really want to draw attention to these things because, I again, from a young age, I sought to kind of break all of these glass ceilings in a way, to kind of prove I was driven. Like, again, it was a challenge of, you're not going to say that because I was born to a teenage mother that I'm not going to amount to anything. You're not going to uh, feed my body full of medications that are going to continue to make me be sick and malnourished. I'm going to figure out a way to nourish my body in a natural way, like we were doing before. Children have an opinion, they have a very valuable voice and should be heard. We should not always constantly be making decisions for children. We need to empower children to make decisions for themselves, and then again, because I was a knowledge seeker, because I was very curious and I sought out the answers. In one of my other videos, I had told a story about the sponge where my friend was asking, why are the sponges wet whenever you buy them? And then I was like, it's because in the process of them sitting on the shelf, if they get dry, then they'll break, and no one wants to buy broken sponges. And then she was just like, oh, you know so much, don't you? Right. And so again, it's not that I'm more or less intelligent than anyone else, it's that I go and I do the next step to find the answer, which is what anyone can do, right? And then of course, being a female, being devalued in the 80s and the 90s, um there are lots of stories of women being devalued. The gender pay gap, right? There are lots of examples, and I'm sure that in your own life you can find your own examples. If you have a comment, make sure that you comment below. And then of course being brown, because intelligent brown people didn't have a voice, they didn't have a say. They were still second class citizens in the 80s and 90s. So I am going to take a break here because I think that the video is getting a little bit long, and I'm going to jump into the next segment. I hope that you guys come back for the second installment of the value series, and I will see you soon.